Hello, good evening, and thanks so much for joining us today. Um, we're talking today with Dr. Liam Young, who is part of the Communication and Media Studies program. So thank you again for joining us. This evening spotlights some of the very interesting topics we cover in our classes in the Bachelor of Communication or Media Studies, or BCom's degree. And so today we're going to hear a short lecture from Professor Liam Cole Young, who's going to talk about how sports became big business and big culture. If you have any questions or comments, please hold them until after the lecture. We're gonna have a Q&A at the end. You can also pop them into the chat. And you can get in touch with us to follow up if you have any questions at communication@cunet.carleton.ca, or you can follow us on social media at CommsCarleton. So Dr. Young teaches a course called Sports and as Media in our program, in which he covers similar topics to those he's going to be talking about today. This is just one of the many offerings in the Bachelor of Communication and Media Studies that allow students to critically engage areas that are of great interest to them. From the first year in our Foundations in Communication and Media Studies course, students begin to learn how studying mediated worlds around them are more important than ever. So BComs is designed to be flexible so that students can then take courses throughout the 4 years of their 20-credit degree that allow them to explore their interests. For example, we offer courses on a wide array of topics, including big data and society, music industries, political communication, communication and health, communication and science, and media, race, and ethnicity, and many, many more. From fake news to TikTok influencers, our degree trains students to ask critical questions about the messages that swirl around them every single day, and to think about how they can shape a better and more equitable future. Communication and media are among the most relevant, exciting, and powerful subjects you can study, and they're fundamental to nearly every human relationship and industry sector. Almost every kind of organization needs to effectively communicate what it does, and our students take many career paths, and our degree prepares them to be adaptable for the jobs of tomorrow. Our program is one of the most established in Canada, spanning more than 40 years. And at the same time, we've kept pace with rapid changes, in part by infusing our program with new courses and experts in our field. Our faculty are award-winning and internationally recognized, and Dr. Liam Cole Young is no exception. Dr. Young is an assistant professor in communication and media studies. He researches and teaches courses on media theory, infrastructure, technology, and internet culture. In his work, he tries to uncover the hidden meanings and consequences of things we take for granted, such as pop music charts, shipping containers, Y2K and the first dot-com crash, canoes in the North American fur trade, sports, gambling, and even common table salt. Some of these things show up in his first book, List Cultures, Knowledge and Poetics from Mesopotamia to BuzzFeed. And recently he's been co-organizing a conference and a special journal issue, Into the Air, which explored the history of communication and media studies as a field. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Liam Young. Thanks.
Thanks, Miranda. Welcome, everyone. I'm just getting my slides up and running, so hopefully everyone can see that. Is that good? Miranda, can you give me a thought? Yeah, great. Okay, so thanks for coming. It's really wonderful to be here with you. My name's Liam Young. I'm happy to give a little sort of sneak preview of our Communication and Media Studies program. It's a great program. I love our students. I really enjoy working with all my colleagues, and I hope to see many of you with us next year. So one of the things about our program that I think is most exciting is just how broad and applicable are its themes and ideas. In comms, as Miranda was just talking about, we study everything from how TikTok and Instagram have transformed celebrity culture to how new streaming platforms like Netflix and Apple TV have changed film and television industries, to the role of propaganda and disinformation in world affairs, such as we've lately been seeing with the ongoing war in Ukraine. But we also spend time thinking about deeper histories of communication, about the many ingenious ways that humans have devised for sending messages and meaning to one another across ever vaster distances. from smoke signals and torches in prehistoric societies to the earliest forms of writing like hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt, up through postal systems that began to carry letters and other material in Persian, Indian, and Roman empires, between 500 and 150 BCE. And then, of course, we think a lot about modern media that arose in the 19th century, things like the telegraph and Morse code, early telephone systems, devices for recording sound, radio, wireless communication, and eventually digital computers and mobile media and our ubiquitous screens. All of these devices and techniques were devised with a common goal: connection, sending messages and conveying meaning across distances in space. But they also end up communicating information about human societies through time, whether we want them to or not, in the ways that they remain as material records of things that have happened. So history deposits itself through media like paper, photographs, tape, or digital code. And there are many stories that can be told by reading these objects and by tracing and mapping these changes. And that's what we do in comms. So I wanted to talk to you tonight about sports. And why? So why talk about sports? Because I think that sports is an area where we can see a lot of these changes that I've just been talking about really clearly. So all we have to do is think about like how important the act of writing things down is for any kind of sports leagues, things like scores, achievements, schedules, championships, awards. In fact, the word that we use to talk about past accomplishments is connected to this media act, records, as in recording. Or think about the importance of photography and different imaging technologies, freeze frame, slow motion, highlights, ISO cams. All of these things are about using recorded images to glean information or to tell stories. So a photo finish tells us who won the race. An instant replay tells us whether the play was legal. An isolated camera angle shows us how a player can improve their technique or their performance. Media technologies are crucial for fans too. Being able to see what happened through a replay, or also, sharing clips and highlights online to convey our appreciation or our interest. We find and share this information with like-minded folks, which is how fan communities and cultures emerge. So sports are always mediated. This is one of the first kind of key themes that is going to infuse through all the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. And these collectives, or these fan cultures of which we are all a part, whether we often choose to be or not, is another reason why I thought sports would be a good topic. It's an area of culture that's totally ubiquitous. Even if we don't think of ourselves as sports fans, almost all of us have at least some level of knowledge or experience watching or playing sports. Even if it's just things that we've absorbed by osmosis from our family and friends, or just being in common spaces, such as this bar in the background here. I also think it's really interesting how sports, kind of like the weather, is one of those topics that we use to just sort of fill time in conversation, right? Or through which we connect with someone that we've just met or that we don't know. Sports, it's kind of a low stakes, casual topic that we can use to ease the awkwardness in a variety of social settings. So whether it's the Olympic Games or the Super Bowl or the Canadian women's and men's soccer teams qualifying for the World Cup, sports make for perfect chit chat. I think chatting is a genre of conversation that's really interesting and maybe not well understood, right? It's less serious or intimate than having a conversation. It's less formal than speaking with someone, but it's more intimate than forms of professional communication. So sports is chit chat. It's one of those things that seems to fill up the little pockets of everyday life that we don't often think very much about. Not just in terms of our conversations, but also just think about how often in a given week you come across a sporting event being played on a screen in the background, like in this image, right? Whether it's at a bar or at home, or you're on the bus and someone's playing highlights on their phone. So sports is ambient. It's part of the fabric of everyday life. But sports are also deeply historical. They've been around for a super long time. For at least 3,000 years, and probably much longer, humans have created games that have allowed themselves to test the limits of their bodies in terms of speed, in things like running or swimming, or in terms of strength, when we're thinking about lifting, pulling, or throwing, endurance, right? The repetition of something over a really long duration or distance, or in terms of technique, so operating one's body in a kind of optimal way. The Olympic Games is probably the oldest formal environment for such competition that we have. So for 1,000 years, from about 750 BCE to 400 AD, the ancient Greeks would come together to stage various competitions. The Olympics went dormant for a long time, but then they were revived in their modern form with the 1896 Athens Games. So these long histories remind us that sports are some of the oldest and most resilient rituals that humans have performed together over time. So sports are always mediated by various technologies. They are ambient, part of the fabric of everyday life, and they are historical. They've been around for a really long time. And then a fourth thing that jumps out when thinking just generally or expansively about what sports are, why we might want to study them, is just how important they are as content, right? So I mentioned how often we see sports on screens around us in physical space. In online spaces, sports are everywhere too. So highlight clips, animated GIFs, Twitter chatter about a game, traditional journalistic coverage, this kind of stuff. It's all content for the endless churn of our social media feeds. And sports are also kind of unique in the way that they're one of the last, I think, or one of the few remaining popular forms of live programming on television, right? We just have so few shared cultural events that happen simultaneously now. We're all kind of distributed. Our attentions are distributed and we're watching things like on demand. But events like the Olympics or the World Cup or the Super Bowl, these draw in massive audiences and give people a shared experience of watching something together and simultaneously, even if we are distanced in physical space. This was, I think, part of the reason why people were so pleased when sports returned during the first wave of the pandemic, right? Everyone around the world was feeling super isolated. But professional sports gave us a distraction. It gave us a kind of feeling of togetherness or of reconvening with one another, even though we had to remain at a physical distance from each other. So sports have always been at the center of these different media environments as content, whether we're thinking about traditional kind of print and broadcast environments of like the 20th century, when we're thinking about things like newspapers or magazines or radio or television, or as content in today's more fragmented environment of social media and streaming platforms. So in sum, sports are content transmitted by media networks, right? Radio, television, digital streaming, yet they are also rituals that mediate collective social meanings, identities, values, or rules in a given society. Hence the name of this lecture, Sports and as Media, and the name of the course from which the lecture derives, right? So sports and the media, but also sports as complicated forms of media themselves. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview of some of the many ways that we could explore sports in relation to media and communication and how this course fits with some of the others in our program. But now I want to get a little more specific in terms of time and place. So one of the things I'm most interested in is the story of how sports became big business, right? You know, sports have been part of human culture for so long, as I've been talking about, but in a particular historical moment, they transformed into these huge global mega businesses. I'm really interested in like how that happened and why it happened in the ways that it did. And in order to understand that, we have to go back in time. And I wanted to start in a perhaps surprising place, just to kind of keep everyone on their toes, not with an athlete or a league, but instead with a rock and roll album. So come back with me to 1983, which was the year that the American rock band Huey Lewis and the News released their album called Sports. Why begin the story here? Why start with this kind of quaint bit of nostalgia from the early 80s? Well, this album was massive. It's hard to convey how popular it was. It was #1 on the Billboard charts. It spawned like 4 or 5 top 10 hits. It sold, I think, 7 or 8 million album copies. But even beyond those numerical figures, like this band and Huey Lewis, the front man, who's kind of right above me here, was absolutely all pervasive through the 80s, and particularly this album. It was on every radio station. And a couple of years later, they had a song in Back to the Future 2, which was one of the biggest movies of the decade. So it's really, I think, hard to convey just how popular this band was, but also how weird it was that this band was so popular, and how weird it was that this frontman, Huey Lewis, who looks like a suburban middle-class dad, became the biggest rock star in the world, which he really was for a period of time. So this is interesting to me. And one of the things that's so interesting about Huey Lewis, about this band and this album, is that I think it kind of encapsulates or is emblematic of these processes that had been underway for quite a while, in which the countercultural movements of the 1960s and the early 1970s had been kind of gradually eroded or dulled or blunted. So things like early rock and roll music, which had this really kind of hard countercultural anti-establishment edge, or things like the hippie movement, right, in the 1960s, and the kinds of experiments with different ways of living or being in the world together. So living in communes, taking psychoactive drugs, things like anti-war protests that were at the center of the 1960s, the civil rights movement. By the 1980s, the kind of harder edge of these things, of these movements, had been almost entirely eroded. And what we ended up with was this safe, corporate, sanitized dad rock at the center of American music culture. And American culture was increasingly becoming exported into this kind of global monoculture throughout the 1980s. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that there weren't super interesting other things happening in music, right? Particularly in like Black communities with the rise of hip hop. But what I'm saying is that the mainstream vision in America of what was popular, as reflected in sales and kind of cultural prevalence, was typified by Huey Lewis and the News. And their album was called Sports. I think that's important. I think that's worth thinking about. So I have this kind of intentionally provocative slide here. I'm going to just like minimize myself so you can read it. Apologies to any Huey Lewis and the News fans in the house. But I say here, Huey Lewis and the News is kind of a dumb band, but the title and cover of its sports album are worth thinking about as emblematic of important cultural shifts in the 1980s. So what do I mean here? Among the notable things about this album is the title choice and the iconography of the cover, right? So the fact that they called it Sports and the way that they organized the cover. So this is a kind of pool hall, right? And this pool hall looks as much like a dorm room as a bar. It's a space that in some ways has been scrubbed of any of its grit or grime or kind of lived experience, or we don't see any of the types of people that we might expect to find in a bar like this. Instead, it looks almost like a mall or an airport. It's very safe, it's very clean. It's just a place for a couple of beers and a couple of laughs with the boys. So it's coded as very masculine, very white, very kind of middle class kind of space. The cover sanitizes this space, making it safe for the kind of person who listens to Huey Lewis, someone who's middle class, someone who's from kind of the Midwest or middle America, someone who's middle-aged. So I guess the argument I'm making, or the thing I'm putting on the table for us to think about, is that I think this cover similarly sanitizes sports by claiming it for this fan base, right? So we see football on the TV in the background. We see sports flags on the wall. We see a dartboard. We see some other paraphernalia behind the bar. In a way, the type of fan that the band is hailing here with this iconography are coming to understand themselves in this period of the 1980s as the kind of ideal sports fan. And I think imagery like this is an important part of the way that kind of community came to view itself as the ideal sports fan, right? A person who, as I've been mentioning, like a person who is white, a person who is upper or middle class, who embodies a particular kind of masculinity as a jock or as a dad. But this band and this cover image also invite a wider array of people from the 1980s that had kind of ascended to the top of business and culture. So people from the corporate world, from the world of finance, golf dudes, corporate executives, MBA students, and this type of crowd is the type of crowd that is kind of invited into this space. So these cultural drifts that are part of the story of the 1980s are famously satirized in the novel and the film called American Psycho, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm not going to show the clip because I find clips on Zoom don't really work, but you can find this on YouTube. There's a scene in the film where Patrick Bateman, who's the main character, who's a kind of high finance dude, and he moonlights as a psychotic serial killer, and he's a huge Huey Lewis fan, right? So it's kind of satirizing the fan base of this band and the way that they understood themselves and the way that they kind of ascended to the top end or the mainstream of culture. So in the same way that the album cover sanitizes this bar, I think that the decade of the 1980s sanitized sports in general, right? They transformed sports from a kind of gritty, regional, more marginal cultural presence into a colossus, right? Something that was available for mass consumption. So that the 1980s was about dulling and blunting the harder edge of athletes and leagues and games and sporting communities and cultures. I would say over the course of 10 or 15 years, let's say from 1980 to 1995, most North American sports leagues became scrubbed of any kind of controversial elements or countercultural elements or political elements. Those political resonances of athletes or communities were kind of buried way down deep. The oddities and idiosyncrasies and bizarre characters that had been part of sporting cultures for a very long time were kind of made to fall in line with this like sort of heavily corporatized and mass culture form of sports leagues. And as a result, in the 1980s, sports leagues become this almost utopian space of ideas about the American dream, right? And I think some of those ideals are channeled in the iconography of this album cover. The idea that anyone in sports can make it, right? Regardless of race or creed or background or class position, right? In this way, people started to understand sports as kind of connected to some of these mythologies that are at the heart of like North American culture or certain forms of North American identity, right? Ideas like meritocracy or stories of rags to riches class elevation, or the idea that we somehow live in a post-racial society where like racism doesn't exist, or the merit of athletic performance will be enough to transcend racial barriers, or things like old-fashioned family values, right? So I'm thinking of someone here like Don Cherry, who became super popular in the 1980s, and articulated to sports a certain vision of what, you know, tradition was, or what Canadian identity meant, right? And so many of these things are at the core of these mythologies around America or North America, and they became really amplified in how they were grafted onto sports leagues and sports teams in the 1980s. So to be clear, like many of these things had been identified with sports for a long time, but I think the 1980s was the moment that they crystallized, right, as these kinds of dominant mythologies within North American sports leagues. The leagues began to kind of consciously cultivate these values or these stories or these ideals in the way that they presented themselves to potential consumers and fans. This was, I think, a lever that the professional sports leagues in North America used to pry open the door into becoming big businesses, right? Making huge profits and becoming accepted by a wider community of consumers. So we think of sports today as massive big businesses, but they haven't always been this way. The 1980s, I think, is the moment that marks, the 1980s marks the moment at which North American pro sports leagues complete this long journey from the margins into the center of cultural and economic life. So this would be the moment if it was a documentary of the riding high montage, right? The 80s was like, everything was good, like the leagues were growing, the athletes were getting paid more money, the owners were happy. And this came after a period in the 1970s of rapid and aggressive expansion in almost all the leagues, which had previously been much smaller and much more regional. So just think about the NHL, right? The National Hockey League only had 6 teams until 1967. It was very small, it was very regional, it was a kind of provincial league. There wasn't much money at stake, right? Players weren't making very much, owners weren't making very much. Players had to have summer jobs in a lot of these leagues. So here's a sports card of Kenneth Lee McMullen, who it says here, Ken works in a service station in the off season. So this is a baseball player. In the 1970s, all leagues were expanding aggressively, founding more teams in more cities, putting more games on television screens, putting more merchandise in stores. It was a period of really trying to grow and scale sports up. So I don't know if any of you have been watching the HBO show on the Los Angeles Lakers in the 1970s, but that's a really good example of a kind of historical representation of this period, or a fictional representation of this period. So this process takes some time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. The 1970s were really about the heavy lifting, but the fruits of the labor emerge in the 1980s. So to summarize this section, right, throughout the 70s and the 80s, sports leagues were transformed from financially precarious regional curiosities into mass culture mega businesses with truly global reach. They went from million-dollar operations to hundreds of millions or even billions. And the argument I'm making, or what I want to suggest to you, is that in the process of this growth, sports leagues kind of made a Faustian bargain, or a deal with the devil. They chose to dull the edges off, right? Anything that was strange, weird, or controversial had to go. So the Philadelphia Flyers, who had been called the Broad Street Bullies because of the kind of violence that they embodied, went to Wall Street, right? The center of high finance. Madison Square Garden, which is where the New York Rangers and the Knicks play, met Madison Avenue, the heart of advertising and consumer culture. And as a result of this sort of blunting of any sort of anti-establishment edge, leagues and athletes became almost entirely depoliticized. The ethos became just stick to sports. Don't comment on anything. Don't rock the boat. So the NBA wanted no part of anything similar to what had happened in 1961 when the players led a strike and canceled games in the name of racial justice, right? To protest the mistreatment of Black athletes in certain venues and communities. The NFL didn't want players talking about head injuries or life after football and how hard it was and how undercompensated athletes were for the sacrifices they were making with their bodies. The days of someone like Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you know, who was a conscientious objector to being drafted into the Vietnam War. The days of an athlete taking that type of overtly critical or political stance were sort of in the rearview mirror, or at least that's the way the leagues wanted it. I think perhaps nobody embodies these transformations and contradictions as much as Michael Jordan. So that's the next section, be like Mike. So Michael Jordan's drafted by the Chicago Bulls in 1984, 1 year after the release of Huey Lewis's album Sports. He was the third overall pick behind Hakeem Olajuwon and Sam Bowie. He's a top prospect, but and people knew he would be a star, but no one knew he would be the greatest basketball player of all time. Jordan comes from humble beginnings. He had to navigate not only becoming the face of the Chicago Bulls, but also, you know, the expectations of being a high draft pick and eventually becoming the face of the NBA as a league during this period of massive growth and global expansion. So just to give you a sense of the growth, like the average player salary in 1980 was $180,000. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be about $625,000. That's the average salary. That's $300,000 less than today's league minimum, which is $925,000. The average salary in the NBA today is $8 million. So we're talking about exponential growth that's really begins in this period of the 1980s. Far more than players, the owners benefited from this. So franchise values quadrupled in the 1980s. And to give you a sense of the difference, the Boston Celtics sold in 1984 for what would be the equivalent of $45 million today. But the average valuation of an NBA franchise today is $2.6 billion. So we're talking like really exponential growth. At the center of these changes was television, more cable channels like ESPN or TSN in Canada. And those channels were hungry for content. No longer was the audience for a game just its local market, but these cable channels had affiliates all over the continent and increasingly all over the globe. So with so much money at stake, there was a lot of pressure on players to toe the company line and not rock the boat. And part of what made Jordan so unique is that he really embraced these changes in this role. He loved the television cameras loved him, and he was a real trendsetter in endorsement deals. So this newspaper article is from 1984, his rookie season. He had just signed an endorsement deal with Nike, which was completely transformative for sports business. And this is documented really well in the Michael Jordan Netflix documentary, The Last Dance, which maybe some of you have seen. So at this period, we forget now, but Nike was an upstart. It was a distant third or fourth behind Converse and Adidas. Jordan similarly was an unproven talent, just a rookie. Until then, athletic companies only picked proven stars to endorse their products. Jordan didn't even like Nike. He wanted Adidas. Adidas declined his desire to be with them. So did Converse, which are pretty big whoopses for both of those companies. So Nike convinces them and themselves that this is a gamble worth taking, and the two parties sign a deal for $250,000 a year. This was about 2.5 times what the best players in the league were getting, which was about 100,000. And it wasn't just about Jordan endorsing their existing products, but crafting a new shoe for him. So Air Jordans, right, which are so ubiquitous today. To give you a sense of just how good this deal was for both parties, Nike hoped by the end of 4 years with Jordan to sell $3 million of Air Jordans, like $3 million of revenue of Air Jordans. But in the first year alone, they sold $126 million worth. So that's 40 times what their best hopes were 3 years earlier. So Jordan really embraces these changes, but he also came to typify this idea that athletics was or should be somehow apolitical, that athletes should stick to sports. And this is at the heart of one of Jordan's more famous and controversial moments, when he quipped in 1990 that Republicans buy sneakers too. The context of this remark was that Jordan was feeling pressure to weigh in on a Senate race in his home state of North Carolina. There, the Democrat challenger, Harvey Gantt, came from the Black community and was trying to unseat the incumbent Republican, Jesse Helms, who was like just an unabashed racist. Throughout his career, Helms stoked resentment against the Black community for political gain. He voted against the Civil Rights Act. If ever there was a politician against whom an athlete could align themselves in a relatively uncontroversial way, it was Helms. Yet Jordan refused. He justified his decision using an economic argument. Republicans wear sneakers too. This signaled, I don't want to alienate such a huge consumer base. And Jordan always maintained a variation of this position. I'm a basketball player and a businessman, and that's what I'm qualified to speak on. And this position makes sense. And I'm not, making a moral judgment against Jordan here, like particularly as a Black athlete, someone like Michael Jordan or LeBron James shoulder an immense amount of pressure from so many different directions. The burden of representation is real. But I think what's interesting about this position is the way it fed into these larger political and economic transformations that I've been talking about. So it kind of glosses over these long histories in which sports and athletics have always been political. Whether we're talking about Jesse Owens winning 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Games, which were hosted by the Nazi Party, Owens' very presence, let alone his success, was a direct rejoinder to the Nazis' openly racist myths about white supremacy. Or whether we're thinking about Billie Jean King, a female tennis player who fought tirelessly for gender equity throughout the 1960s and 70s. Or if we're thinking more generally about how sports are spaces for people to work out complicated feelings about identity, place, nationalism, and these types of things. Just think about the thorny question of Canadian identity and who is included in that category, who is excluded, right? And for a lot of people, that question gets worked out through something like hockey. And then importantly, you've always had athletes engaged in the politics of their moment, right? Protesting openly about things like racial injustice in ways that they stopped in the 1980s and 90s, or were encouraged to stop in the 1980s and 90s. So here we see Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fists in solidarity with the civil rights movement and emerging Black Power movements on the podium of the Olympic Games in Mexico in 1968. And then I mentioned earlier, Muhammad Ali objecting to the Vietnam War, the strike in 1961 by NBA players over the mistreatment of Black athletes. So the point being, like, as sports becomes big business through the 70s and especially the 80s, all of this kind of history gets scrubbed, right? And this continues well into the 1990s. While for the most part, the good times were rolling in the 90s and the leagues continued to grow, there was also something kind of darker lingering under the surface. So this will be the last section of the lecture, the return of the repressed. So the politics of race, pressures of celebrity, hyper-competitive environments of where so much money is at stake, those things can only be tamped down for so long. Inevitably, things are going to bubble to the surface. So these things are all kind of simmering in the 1990s. People are starting to speak a little more openly about the toll taken on athletes' bodies, about structural inequities along lines of class and gender, race, and ability, issues of domestic violence and drug use around pro sports, corruption and organized crime in certain leagues, and the way they intersect with like gambling markets. All of these things had been kind of repressed by the leagues in the name of expansion and mainstreaming and to kind of bubble up, right? Typified, I think, by someone like O.J. Simpson, who, famous football player, achieved just a huge degree of celebrity through the 70s and 80s, and then goes on trial for murder in the mid-90s for murdering his ex-wife and one of her friends. So this unfolded through 1994 and 95. And it's a really interesting and important case study where we see sports intersecting with not just like the politics of race and policing, but also things like the emerging 24/7 news cycle with things like CNN, and an increasingly invasive celebrity tabloid culture, right? So people sometimes talk about OJ being the like original reality TV star because the trial was like broadcast on television in real time. So in the 90s, these things are simmering. They're kind of just starting to bubble up. But recently, I think they've really exploded to the surface. So I just wanted to end with a few notes about some more recent developments in which sports are kind of reclaiming this mantle of politics, right? Sports seem to have a renewed urgency and intensity around social and political issues that have for a long time been pushed away. So athletes have rediscovered activism and their political power, right? Many have been speaking more openly about their moral and ethical duties as public figures to speak to issues like the Black Lives Matter protests, particularly in the summer of 2020, led by the WNBA, where athletes actually went on strike and postponed games. But also things like vaccines and public health or the war in Ukraine. Right, it's now almost expected that athletes will speak to these things, will have things to say. So we are a long way from Michael Jordan's Republicans wear sneakers too. Obviously, economic pressures are still there, right? Big business, leagues are big business, huge ticket, merchandise sales, international profiles. There's big pressure on individual athletes to grow their brand and have a kind of social media outreach. And they have to balance these desires and these pressures with their desires and responsibilities to speak to social and political issues. This is, I think, the dynamics of the way athletes have to navigate these questions have shifted quite rapidly. And beyond this, sports continues to play, I think, a really important role in things like science and technology or knowledge, the way we know about the world. Sports are a kind of laboratory for research and ideas that travel into other sectors of the culture. They're a breeding ground for new technologies of measuring time and space or performance, thinking about like Amazon Web Services and the way they're measuring the angle of the ball or the exit velocity of a baseball. New modes of filming and broadcasting, platforms and streaming, even new medical technologies. Sports is a kind of breeding ground or a laboratory for people to experiment with these things. And these experiments have implications for the way we know about the world, the way we think about the world. You just have to think about the kind of overlap between something like baseball statistics and analytics and the way that's changed the way baseball is played and managed, and the way that it overlaps with like changes in finance, the way that quantification and new modes of statistical analysis have kind of reshaped like the stock market and other sectors of the economy. So these are just some of the themes and stories that we explore in the course Sports and as Media. And I think they come most clearly into view when we adopt this wider view of media and communication than perhaps we are used to using. So it's not just about sports and the media, how things are covered or issues of representation, but it's also about how sports are themselves mediators of all these social, economic, technological, and political issues. So we think about how people make meaning together through sports, how they understand themselves in relationship to one another, how they understand themselves in relation to their historical moment or the place in which they live. It's about communion and the coming together of communities, the drama of the human world, right? The performance of certain roles and certain tensions. Really, it's about how communities come to form over long arcs of time. So I wanted to end with a quote from a really famous communication theorist named James Carey. And James Carey was writing about newspapers, but I think we can apply it to sports. And he says, in sports, what is arrayed before the viewer is not pure information, but a portrayal of the contending forces in the world. As viewers watch, they engage in a continual shift of roles or of dramatic focus. Sports are a presentation of reality that gives life an overall form, order, and tone. So the idea here is that we move beyond just enjoying sports as entertainment or a zone of pure pleasure. We're looking for critical and historical distance to push our thinking beyond cliches or common sense, right? But also I wanted to say, I'm not out here to convince you that sports are evil, right? This is not a pure condemnation of sports, right? I love sports. I always have, I always will. And they're too important, I think, for all the reasons that I've been discussing to simply dismiss them as bad. Instead, with the course, we try to tack somewhere in the middle between these two poles, right? Somewhere that's hospitable to both critics of sports and enthusiasts to develop a kind of shared language and different vehicles for understanding one another. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your attention and your interest. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have about anything I've talked about here or about the program or anything at all.
Okay, thank you so much, Liam. That was really fascinating and interesting. I want to ask now if anybody has any questions that would like to ask you, they can either pop those in the chat or they can also just unmute their mic and ask their questions. Yep. Okay, seeing none, I have a question, so I'll ask it, and then if anyone else has one, please feel free to ask after I've asked mine. So I'm wondering, we talked a bit about the sanitization of sports in the 80s and 90s, and I remember reading in a book about the use of pink ribbons as a social marketing kind of strategy in the NFL, that this was also a way to try to expand market share to women, right? And part of that was also a kind of sanitization of some of the problems you had mentioned before, domestic violence and drug use and so on. It was a way of addressing this. So mostly this was pitted toward white women, according to Samantha King, who wrote this book, Pink Ribbons, Inc. So I'm wondering if you could talk at all about that kind of expansion into new markets for sports in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. That's a great question. I mean, yeah, like the different kinds of strategies or corporate communication strategies that different leagues employ is like a super fascinating topic, and they're all thinking about it in the language that you're using of like market share, right? So it's about like what are the things that this market that we have yet to tap into care about or interested in, right? And so many of those assumptions are heavily coded in lots of different directions, like so toward white women, toward a particular idea of like femininity, right? Or masculinity. And so I think that it's a great example of like another way into thinking about the function of sports within the culture and the way that like economic interests and cultural assumptions and values intersect in this area, right? Through these different incentive structures, right? So like the leagues want to grow, the players, the players are invested in growing the league, so they kind of, are incentivized to go along with sometimes approaches to corporate outreach or communications that they don't agree with. And so then it's really interesting to watch both the way like the leagues navigate that at a broad level, but then also the way individual athletes do too. So I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about sports, I think, is the way that as I said, all of these things kind of converge in them. And so thank you for modeling for us, and just yet another way we can think about it.
Okay, any other questions? Please feel free to just jump in.
Or in the chat too, is fine. How many of you would consider yourselves sports fans? How many of you would consider yourselves not sports fans? Yeah. Well, one of the things that's really nice, so I've taught the course a number of times now, and it's not just for sports fans, right? Like I really am try to be attentive to the fact that that we're all coming in with different degrees of knowledge and different kinds of commitments and stuff. And so that I actually prefer when we have a broad kind of spectrum of people with different interests and different kind of commitments. And it makes for really exciting and interesting conversations when we can use sports as a case study to kind of have these larger debates about culture and identity and all those types of things.
I have a question, just more on how this relates to the overall program. Would a lecture like this be found in the first year realm, or is this something that you dive into more in your upper years of communications?
Yeah, I think maybe both of us can speak to this. So I think probably a topic like this would be introduced in the first year, maybe in the foundations course or the current issues course, which are both required courses at the first year that students will take. And then perhaps their interest might be piqued later in courses like communication, culture, and identity. They may find themes that relate to a course like this. And then this course that Liam is talking about is at the fourth year. So it's a brand new course, actually. Thanks to Liam for helping us to introduce this course to the curriculum. So it is a course that students would focus on in the fourth year, but perhaps their interest might be piqued in earlier classes leading up to the fourth year, and then they can just focus on that topic in the fourth year. Really, students can focus on courses that relate to their interests earlier on as well, depending on what that course is. So we do have electives courses at the second, third, and fourth year, just depending on which course it is. Liam, did you want to also answer that question?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I would say I think in a first year course, we would get maybe a lecture like this as a kind of shop window, right? So it's like a little bit of a sneak peek of what's at stake in this type of issue, or like all the different ways you could think about it. And then in the upper year courses, you kind of can take the individual threads that I opened up and really kind of like explore them with a little more depth over the course of 12 weeks. So, yeah.
I'm also wondering if maybe we could talk about an example of an assignment. So how would you, this is such an interesting topic, and it seems like the way that you studied it, you've gone about studying it is so diverse. Like you can look at it in lots of different ways. Historically, you can look at contemporary issues. So how would students study sports in your course? And maybe is there an assignment that you could talk about?
Yeah, sure. So I tried to design assignments that are about taking themes and ideas and text from the course and then applying them to things in everyday life. So things that students are interested in. So one of them is an assignment that I make around the Super Bowl. So the course happens in the winter term and the Super Bowl is usually in February. And so one of the weeks in the course is about thinking about the kind of the like aesthetics of sports broadcasts. So the way that they're designed, right, to elicit certain feelings and reactions in the audience, right? So the way that they use sound, the way that they use different camera angles, the way that commentators kind of complement the visual images and things like that. So we develop some tools, and we are introduced to some approaches for thinking about those things and studying them and analyzing them. And then I ask students to take those tools and apply them to the actual Super Bowl as it happens. So they watch the game, they take notes, and then they put it together into an argument. So this term had a number of really great assignments. A couple of them that stick out, one student focused explicitly just on sound. So thinking about the kind of soundscape of the Super Bowl and the way that like the kind of violence of the game is really amplified by the use of microphones and things like that. And then another student thought about the halftime show and the function of the halftime show within the overall kind of media event of the Super Bowl, and what the halftime show was meant to convey and how it was designed to elicit in the audience certain types of feelings and certain types of cultural knowledges and things like that. So that's one assignment. And then another one that I do is it's like a controversies assignment. So I give them a kind of list of topics or controversies in sports where and then I ask them to kind of take a position. So argue, in defense. So one of the favorite ones that students have is like, should college athletes be compensated, like with a salary, given how much money colleges, particularly in the United States, make as a result of collegiate athletics? Like, should the athletes be paid? This has been something that's been debated for decades. And so students kind of look around and see like who has said what on this topic, and then they craft a position and make an argument.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So it looks like Gabrielle has a question. What would the curriculum look like for this course, and how would exams and projects work?
That is a great question. Can I pull up the syllabus and just kind of give a really quick overview of some of the topics? Just give me 1 second to pull it up here. You're testing the speed of my screen share. Can everyone see that? Okay. So I'll just zip down here. So maybe I'm going to zoom it in so I can see a little bit better. So I've kind of organized it in 2 halves. So the first half, we think about sports as media, and the second half, we think about sports and the media. So we walk through, kind of some of the different ways that media technologies have been used to measure different things in different sports over time. So that's the week on space and time. And then we move into thinking about form and aesthetics. And then we talk about, sports and nationalism, the idea of spectacle in the Super Bowl. And then when there's a snowstorm or convoy interruptions, we don't have class that week. Then in the second half of the course, we take what is maybe a more traditional approach to thinking about like the economics of sports. So thinking about like television deals and how much money is made through licensing deals, but also like the emergence of fantasy sports and these other kinds of economies that emerge. So, and you can kind of see here that I try to mix things up. So we have texts, scholarly texts, but also stuff from newspapers or magazines. There's also like some short films, some documentaries, and these types of things. And then, and as we move through the second half of the course, the theme that emerges is really about athlete activism and the different ways that activism has figured into sports through different moments. So some of the material that it was in the lecture today was drawn directly from the conversations that I had with students. And then in terms of like exams and stuff, because it's a 4th year class, it's less exam centered and it's more about assignments. So you can see there's 3 assignments here. One is the Super Bowl one I was talking about, then controversies. And then we do a case studies assignment, which is much more open-ended. So students can take an athlete or an event that they're really interested in and then develop an argument or a kind of historical analysis that compares that athlete to a precursor from a previous moment. So for instance, if you wanted to compare like Michael Jordan's approach to politics and to social conversations to someone like Muhammad Ali. So you kind of compare and contrast them there and write an argument. And then the last thing is just a capstone conversation where I meet with each student one-on-one to just kind of discuss like what they've what they've learned from the course and what they're taking from it. And I prefer that in a fourth year setting to a more formal exam because it just opens up lots of different possibilities and then allows me to kind of learn from students as much as them learning from me. So that's just, an example, one iteration of what this course could look like. But I change it up because sports is so ever changing and dynamic that it's good to mix it up from year to year. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Well, I'm going to pop our contact information into the chat. So please feel free to follow up. We can, if you have questions specifically for Dr. Young, we can forward them on to him. And I'm sure he's happy to field those and to talk about sports and as media all day long with you. So please do feel free to get in touch. Also, if you have questions just about the program more generally, I'm happy to answer those. I can talk about how the curriculum operates and some of the other classes you might be taking from the first year foundations course, which I mentioned before, through your theory and methods courses, as well as all the other electives that we offer. And into the fourth year when you will be taking courses, possibly like the one Dr. Young teaches, as well as workshop courses, which will help you build your dossier to help to present to potential employers. So happy to answer any questions you might have. So please feel free to get in touch. And I really want to thank Dr. Young and give him a round of applause for spending this evening with us talking about sports and as media. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you as well for joining us. And take care. We'll hang out maybe for another minute or two if you'd like to speak with us. But otherwise, I wish you a good night and good luck as you have an exciting year ahead of you as you decide on what you're going to be doing for university next year. So take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.